"Get this man out of my courtroom." Judge Richard Holloway's voice thundered across the hall, his gavel striking down like a hammer of fate. The crowd gasped. The elderly man stood there, silent. His wrinkled hands gripped the cane in front of him, his posture slightly hunched, his gray suit hanging loosely on his thin frame. He wasn't shaking in fear. No, he was calm. Too calm for a man being humiliated in front of a packed courtroom. "You're a disgrace, old man." Judge Holloway sneered, adjusting his black robe. "This is a place for real lawyers, not relics from a forgotten past. You think you can just walk in here, mumble a few words, and waste this court's time?" The snickers from the prosecution table, the murmurs from the audience. Everything was against the old man. That's when it happened. A junior clerk burst through the doors, a folder clutched in his trembling hands. He looked frantic, his forehead glistening with sweat as he stammered, "Your Honor, there's something you need to see." The judge snatched the file, rolled his eyes, and flipped it open. His smirk disappeared in an instant. His face turned pale. His fingers shook as he read through the pages. Gasps filled the room. The bailiff took an unconscious step backward. The lead prosecutor's jaw went slack. The courtroom, which had been alive with whispers, fell into a dead silence. And then, for the first time in his entire career, Judge Richard Holloway, the most feared judge in the district, looked utterly terrified. Who was this man? 2 weeks earlier, Thomas Blake gripped the old leather briefcase in his hands as he shuffled into the courthouse. It had been years since he had stepped into a courtroom, and today, the air felt heavier than before. He walked slowly, the echoes of his cane tapping against the polished floors. To most people, he was just an old man, a nobody. But once he had been someone. Someone great. The only problem? No one remembered. As he walked past the young lawyers in their expensive suits, he caught their amused glances, their smirks. To them, he was just another frail senior citizen, probably lost. "Excuse me, sir." A woman at the reception desk called out. "Are you looking for someone? Do you need assistance?" Thomas smiled. "I have a case today." She blinked, then laughed. "You? You're an attorney." The scoffing chuckle from a nearby lawyer didn't go unnoticed. "Come on, Susan, don't waste his time. Maybe he means he's here to watch a case." Thomas exhaled, unshaken. "No, I mean exactly what I said. I have a case today, and I need to check in." Susan's smile faded slightly. "What's your name, sir?" "Thomas Blake." Her fingers clattered on the keyboard as she searched. Suddenly, her eyebrows furrowed. "Wait, your name is actually here." "I know," Thomas replied, his eyes twinkling with something unreadable. Susan looked genuinely confused. Well, welcome, Mr. Blake. You can proceed to courtroom 3. Thomas nodded and made his way toward the room, ignoring the quiet chuckles behind him. He could hear them whispering. "Who let this old man back in court? He won't last 5 minutes. What a joke." Thomas reached the large wooden doors and exhaled slowly before stepping inside. The moment he entered, all eyes turned to him. And just as before, he was met with nothing but disbelief. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "Is he lost? Dear God, he's holding a cane. Can he even walk properly?" The lead prosecutor, James Calloway, was the first to speak. "Your Honor, are we really going to entertain this?" He gestured toward Thomas with an exaggerated eye roll. "This man is obviously past his prime. We're here for a serious case, not a retirement home talent show." The courtroom chuckled. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Sir, what exactly are you doing here?" Thomas met his eyes without flinching. "I'm here as the defense attorney for this case." Silence. Then laughter. Loud, unfiltered laughter. Even Judge Holloway cracked a smirk. "Oh, this is rich. This might just be the funniest thing I've seen all year." The prosecution table was shaking with laughter. The audience whispered in amusement. "Mr. Blake," Judge Holloway said, his voice dripping with mockery, "I don't know what you think this is, but I don't have time for games. If you're representing someone, I suggest you sit down and hope you don't embarrass yourself further." The courtroom roared again, but Thomas remained calm. He took slow, steady steps toward the defense table and placed his briefcase down with careful precision. He sat, folded his hands, and looked straight ahead, ignoring the cruel smiles around him. It didn't matter. He knew something they didn't. The trial began, and as expected, James Calloway was ruthless. He was young, charismatic, and confident, a rising star in the legal world. He tore into Thomas's client, presenting evidence in a way that made everything look open and shut. And Thomas? He barely spoke. He sat, listening, nodding occasionally. People started whispering again. He's got nothing. He's completely outmatched. What a shame. As the trial continued, Thomas remained still, absorbing everything. Then came the moment that changed everything. Thomas finally stood. He adjusted his tie, picked up a single sheet of paper, and walked to the center of the courtroom. The judge sighed. "Mr. Blake, I sincerely hope this isn't a waste of time." Thomas looked at the prosecution table, then at the jury, then at the audience. Then he spoke. The first few words were calm, measured. Then he picked up speed. What happened next would be talked about in legal circles for years to come. Thomas Blake didn't just cross-examine the witnesses, he dismantled them. He didn't just present evidence. He wove it into a story so airtight that there was no room for doubt. Every time Calloway objected, Thomas countered with a legal precedent so precise that the judge had no choice but to allow it. Every time the prosecution tried to shake him, Thomas barely blinked. And then, Calloway started to sweat. His confidence wavered. The audience's murmurs changed. "Wait a minute. Did you see that? Hold on, this old guy is actually..." One by one, every so-called solid piece of evidence fell apart under Thomas's relentless logic. And by the time he was finished, Judge Holloway wasn't smirking anymore. Neither was Calloway. The courtroom had never been this silent. Then, Judge Holloway cleared his throat, his voice weaker than before. "Mr. Blake," he swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. Who are you?" Thomas finally smiled. That's when the doors burst open, and the young clerk ran in, holding the file that would shake the entire room. Judge Holloway flipped through the pages, his eyes widening with each word. His hands trembled. The legendary cases, the victories, the history, and suddenly he knew. Thomas Blake wasn't just some old man. He was a legend, and the courtroom had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The silence in the courtroom stretched long enough to feel heavy. Judge Holloway's eyes darted between the file in his hands and the elderly man sitting before him. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. The young clerk, still out of breath from his mad dash, stood frozen by the doorway, clearly aware that he had just shattered the courtroom's reality. Everyone else remained equally stunned. The same people who had mocked Thomas Blake moments ago now wore expressions of disbelief, even fear. Prosecutor James Calloway, the rising star of the legal world, clenched his jaw. His once confident smirk had vanished. "Your Honor," Calloway finally said, attempting to regain control of the moment. "What's going on?" Judge Holloway didn't respond right away. His hands were still gripping the file as if it were a ghost's whisper, something impossible yet undeniable. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Blake," he hesitated, glancing back down at the pages. Is this actually you?" Thomas remained seated, his expression unchanged. He leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers on the polished wooden table. "That depends," he said in his calm, unhurried voice. "What does it say?" The judge read aloud, his voice almost shaky. "Thomas Blake, former Chief Defense Attorney of the United States, winner of 168 consecutive cases, author of The Art of Cross-Examination, mentor to some of the top lawyers in the country." He flipped the page. "Received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for contributions to the American justice system. Featured in Time magazine's top 10 legal minds of the century." The judge's voice grew quieter. "Considered one of the greatest trial attorneys to ever live." The courtroom gasped. Calloway's face went pale. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen everything, took a step backward. Susan, the receptionist who had laughed at Thomas earlier, was peeking through the courtroom doors, her face frozen in shock. The judge slowly lowered the file and looked directly at Thomas. "I don't understand," he said, struggling to find the right words. Why would a man of your caliber be here, in this small-town case?" Thomas smiled, but his eyes carried something deeper, something unreadable. "Does it matter?" he asked. Holloway swallowed. "Sir, with all due respect, you could have been anywhere. You retired almost 20 years ago." Calloway finally snapped out of his daze. This has to be a mistake," he stammered. "There's no way," he turned toward Thomas. "If you were really Thomas Blake, why the hell would you be defending this case?" The old man exhaled, slowly standing up. For the first time that day, his presence truly filled the room. All the mocking, all the sneers, all the doubts, they were gone. He adjusted his suit, which suddenly didn't seem so outdated anymore. "That," he said, "is a story for another time." He walked toward the judge's bench, his cane tapping against the floor. Your Honor, he continued, may we proceed with the trial? The judge hesitated, still clearly in shock, then nodded stiffly. Why, yes. Proceed. Thomas turned, facing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been told this case is open and shut. His voice was steady, smooth. It had weight now. Calloway tensed. Thomas held the jury's gaze. But what if I told you that what you've been shown is only a fraction of the truth? Silence. Then suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the back of the courtroom. The doors slammed open. A man stormed in, red-faced, furious. It was the town's mayor. Stop the trial, he shouted. This case cannot continue. Gasps filled the room. Judge Holloway shot up from his seat. Mayor Hendricks, what is the meaning of this? The mayor's chest heaved. His eyes darted around wildly, as if desperate. I won't allow this to go any further, he barked. Thomas turned slowly, eyeing the mayor with unreadable calmness. Calloway frowned. Why do you care, Mayor? He asked. The mayor clenched his fists. His eyes flickered toward Thomas, then toward the judge. For the first time, the judge noticed something was off. The mayor wasn't just angry. He was scared. Thomas studied him for a moment, then sighed. Ah, he said, almost to himself. So that's how it is. He walked back to his table, adjusting his papers. Your Honor, he said, I move that the trial continue. Judge Holloway hesitated. Mr. Blake, something strange is happening here. I know, Thomas said. He finally looked the mayor in the eye. That's why we can't stop now. The mayor took a step forward, face contorted with rage. If you don't stop this trial, you'll regret it, Blake. A cold, heavy silence filled the room. Thomas Blake didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he spoke one simple sentence. You already regret underestimating me. And just like that, the mayor went pale. For the first time, it wasn't Thomas who looked vulnerable. It was the people standing against him. The entire courtroom could feel it. Something much bigger was at play here. Something dangerous. And Thomas Blake, he had just walked straight into the fire. The air inside the courtroom shifted. It was no longer just about a trial. Something bigger, darker, was at play. Judge Holloway could feel it. The way Mayor Hendricks stormed in, the way his hands shook at his sides, it wasn't just anger. It was fear. And yet, standing in the middle of it all, Thomas Blake didn't move. He remained calm, studying the mayor the way a chess master studies an opponent's opening move. The mayor's face was turning red. He clenched his fists, glaring at the judge. This trial is over, he growled. I'm shutting it down now. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway's eyes widened. Excuse me. I said it's over, the mayor snapped. This is my city, and I refuse to let a washed-up old man make a mockery of our justice system. But Thomas smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Ah, he murmured. Now I see. The room stilled. Judge Holloway, Calloway, the jury, the audience. Everyone watched as Thomas took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. But his words cut through the room like a scalpel. You're afraid, aren't you? The mayor flinched. Thomas tilted his head, eyes twinkling with something dangerous. You're afraid of what this trial might uncover. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The mayor's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Tell me, Thomas continued, what exactly do you think will happen if I keep going? The mayor's breathing was shallow now. His eyes darted toward Calloway, then toward the judge, as if searching for a way out. Judge Holloway's patience snapped. He slammed his gavel. Mayor Hendricks, unless you have a legal reason to stop this trial, I suggest you take your seat immediately. But the mayor shook his head wildly. You don't understand. He turned to Calloway. Shut him down. Now. Calloway hesitated. Sir, I don't. Do it, the mayor barked. Everyone stared. Calloway swallowed. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. And then, like a dying fire grasping for its last breath, the mayor tried one last move. His voice lowered to a dangerous whisper. Blake, I suggest you walk out of this courtroom while you still can. Judge Holloway's face darkened. Are you threatening an officer of the court? The mayor didn't answer. Thomas simply gave a small chuckle. Threats, he mused. Always a sign of a man who's losing. Then, he turned his back on the mayor without fear. I'll see you after the trial, Thomas called over his shoulder. The mayor clenched his fists, then spun on his heel and stormed out of the courtroom. The door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Judge Holloway exhaled. He rubbed his temples, clearly trying to process what just happened. I don't even know where to start, he he admitted. Thomas walked back to his seat, smoothing out his suit as he Saturday. Shall we proceed, Your Honor? Holloway blinked. You really want to keep going after that? Thomas shrugged. What choice do we have? Calloway finally spoke, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Judge, I don't think we should ignore what just happened. Thomas looked at him. You don't. It wasn't a question. Calloway hesitated, then exhaled. No. Something's off. Thomas studied him. Interesting. Judge Holloway tapped his gavel again. Fine, he muttered. We continue. But, Mr. Blake, I suggest you watch your back. Thomas smiled faintly. I always do. Hours later, the trial pressed forward. Piece by piece, Thomas dismantled the prosecution's case. The evidence wasn't just weak, it was fabricated. Witnesses stuttered. Timelines didn't add up. Even the jury started shifting uncomfortably. Calloway fought back, but for the first time in his career, he was drowning. And Thomas? He didn't push. He waited for Calloway to dig himself into a hole. Then, with surgical precision, Thomas struck. One cross-examination. One contradiction. And just like that, Calloway realized he was losing. The once mighty prosecutor felt his stomach turn. He looked at the jury, at Judge Holloway, at the audience. He was losing to an old man. His face burned with humiliation. Then, crash. The sound of shattering glass rang through the room. Everyone's heads snapped toward the back. The windows. Someone had thrown a brick through the courthouse window. It landed in the aisle. Wrapped around it was a note. The bailiff rushed forward, cautiously unwrapping it. His hands shook as he read it. Then, his face drained of color. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. Bailiff. The bailiff swallowed hard. He turned the note around so the courtroom could see. There were only 4 words written in jagged, angry handwriting. Stop this trial now. A chill settled over the room. Calloway's blood ran cold. Judge Holloway stood up. His jaw clenched. That's it, he said. We're taking a recess. Thomas simply smiled. He looked down at the note, then up at the jury. I believe, he said, someone is getting nervous. The jury shivered. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. Court is adjourned for the day. Everyone scrambled out of the room. But as Thomas stood to leave, he felt something. A presence. Someone watching him. Slowly, he turned toward the shattered window. Across the street, standing in the shadows, a man, wearing a dark coat. Watching, Thomas met his gaze. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, he turned and disappeared. Thomas exhaled. Ah, he murmured to himself. So it's going to be one of those cases. He picked up his briefcase, tapped his cane against the floor, and walked into the storm. The cold wind hit Thomas Blake's face as he stepped outside the courthouse. The air was thick with tension, people whispering, eyes darting nervously toward the shattered window. Somewhere, someone wanted this trial buried. And Thomas Blake had no intention of letting that happen. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, his cane tapping against the pavement. The man he had seen in the shadows was gone now, but Thomas knew better than to think he had vanished. No, whoever that was, they were watching, waiting. As he reached the courthouse steps, a voice called out, Mr. Blake. He turned. Prosecutor James Calloway stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. His usual arrogance was missing. Instead, his face was set in something closer to confusion, and maybe just maybe fear. Calloway, Thomas greeted, his voice calm. I assume you're here to apologize for underestimating me. Calloway huffed out a humorless laugh. Not exactly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen, something's not right. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what gave it away? The mayor storming in, or the brick flying through the window? Calloway's jaw clenched. This isn't how things are supposed to go. This case, it was supposed to be easy. A simple conviction. Thomas studied him. But now, Calloway exhaled, looking at the courthouse like it held a secret he wasn't ready to uncover. Now, I don't know what to think. Thomas tapped his cane against the pavement. You're starting to realize something, aren't you? Calloway didn't answer. Thomas took a step forward. You were handed this case, given evidence that was supposed to make this an open and shut trial. And yet, the more we pull at the threads, the more everything starts to fall apart, Calloway finished, his voice tight. Thomas nodded. So tell me, Calloway, how much do you really know about the man you're trying to put away? Calloway hesitated. Thomas could see the war happening in his head. Then, finally, the prosecutor sighed. Meet me at the diner across the street. 1 hour. Thomas tilted his head. What for? Calloway's eyes darkened. To figure out if we're on the same side. Then he turned and walked away. Thomas watched him go, a small smile playing at his lips. Interesting. He turned back toward the street, but froze. Something was wrong. The feeling hit him like a cold shiver down his spine. He was being watched again. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd. People were scattering, moving in all directions. Then, there, across the street, a man in a dark coat, standing just at the edge of an alleyway. Watching, unmoving. Thomas locked eyes with him. The man didn't blink, didn't move. And then he raised his hand. A slow, deliberate gesture, pointing directly at Thomas. Then, as if he had never been there at all, he turned and disappeared into the alley. Thomas exhaled. The game was just beginning. 1 hour later, the small diner across from the courthouse smelled of coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches. It was one of those places that hadn't changed in decades, checkered floors, red leather booths, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Thomas sat in a corner booth, stirring his tea. The seat across from him remained empty. Until Calloway slid into it, looking more tired than before. He placed a folder on the table. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That for me? Calloway ignored the question. This case, it's not what I thought. Thomas sipped his tea. Go on. Calloway hesitated, then pushed the folder toward him. I pulled some old records. Thomas opened it. His eyes scanned the pages, and for the first time since the trial began, his expression shifted. It was slight, a flicker of something unreadable. But Calloway saw it. What is it? The prosecutor asked. Thomas closed the folder. Tell me, Calloway, do you know who my client really is? Calloway exhaled sharply. A man accused of a crime. Thomas shook his head. No, his fingers tapped the table. He's more than that. He leaned in. 30 years ago, he was a whistleblower. Calloway's face dropped. What? Thomas nodded. He exposed corruption in this very town. Police, government officials, people in power. Calloway's breath hitched. And now? Thomas continued, voice low. They want him silenced. Calloway gripped the edge of the table. So this trial isn't about justice, Thomas finished. It's about revenge. The words hung between them. Then, bang, the diner's front door slammed open. A man rushed inside, panicked. His clothes were dirty, his face drenched in sweat. People turned. The man's wild eyes darted around, until they landed on Thomas. He staggered toward him. Mr. Blake, he choked out. Then, a loud crack split the air. The man collapsed. Screams erupted. Thomas shot up from his seat. The man on the ground gasped, his hands clutching his chest. Blood pooled beneath him. Someone had just shot him. Through the diner window. Chaos exploded around them. Calloway grabbed Thomas's arm. We need to go now. But Thomas was already moving. He knelt next to the man, pressing his hands against the wound. Who did this? He demanded. The man gasped, his eyes glazing over. His lips trembled as he whispered. It's bigger than you think. Then, he went still. Dead. Calloway yanked Thomas to his feet. Move. They bolted toward the back exit as people screamed, ducking for cover. And as Thomas ran, one thought burned in his mind. This wasn't just about a trial. This was a cover-up. And now, he was in the middle of it. The cold air hit Thomas Blake's face as he and Calloway burst through the back exit of the diner. The alley was dark, littered with trash cans and abandoned crates. But there was no time to stop. Behind them, sirens blared. People screamed. The chaos inside the diner was spilling into the streets. A man had just been killed, and Thomas knew exactly what it meant. Someone was trying to bury the truth. Calloway was breathing hard beside him. Who the hell was that guy? Thomas didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he turned sharply down another alley, pulling Calloway with him just as a black SUV screeched onto the street behind them. The vehicle stopped. The tinted windows didn't roll down. No one stepped out. It just sat there, watching, waiting. Thomas narrowed his eyes. He could feel it, the weight of their gaze. Calloway cursed under his breath. We're being followed. Thomas exhaled slowly. Of course we are. Then, before Calloway could react, Thomas stepped out of the shadows. Into the open. Calloway grabbed his sleeve. What are you doing? Thomas ignored him. He faced the SUV. Waited, daring them. Then, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, dressed in a black suit with a silver tie. His face was unreadable, cold, controlled. The kind of man who didn't blink under pressure. Thomas had met his kind before. A fixer. A man who cleaned up other people's messes. The fixer adjusted his cuffs, then spoke in a voice that was too smooth. "Mr. Blake." Thomas tilted his head. "Do I know you?" The fixer smiled. "No, but I know you." Calloway stepped up beside Thomas. "You here to kill us too?" The fixer chuckled. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have seen me coming." Calloway stiffened. Thomas, however, remained calm. "What do you want?" Thomas asked. The fixer took a slow step forward. "A warning." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The fixer nodded. "Walk away, Mr. Blake." His voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "Drop this case. Forget what you think you've uncovered. Go back to wherever you came from and enjoy retirement." Silence. Then Thomas smiled. A slow, knowing smile, and took one step closer. "I think," he said quietly, "you already know my answer." The fixer studied him. His face didn't change, but Thomas saw it, the faintest flicker in his eyes. Something almost like respect. Or was it regret? The fixer sighed. "Shame." Then, without another word, he turned. Slipped back into the SUV. The engine rumbled. Then, just like that, it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Calloway exhaled hard. "You're insane, you know that?" Thomas turned back toward the courthouse in the distance. "Let's go." Calloway blinked. "Where?" Thomas adjusted his tie. "To finish what we started." The next morning, courthouse. The trial resumed. But everything felt different. There was an edge in the air, an unspoken weight pressing down on the courtroom. The jury shifted in their seats. The judge looked more uneasy than before. Even the bailiff's usual strict demeanor was cracking. Everyone knew what had happened. The shattered diner window. The dead man. The message behind it. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the events of last night." Silence. He continued, his voice slightly strained. "Authorities are investigating. However, the trial must proceed." He glanced at Thomas. Almost like a warning. Thomas simply nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." Then, he turned toward the jury. Time to pull the thread. He stood, walking toward the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady. "Yesterday, you were told this case was simple." He let the words hang. "It is not." A murmur rippled through the jury. Thomas clasped his hands behind his back. "The evidence against my client was presented as airtight. Yet, under scrutiny, it has crumbled." He turned slightly, meeting Calloway's gaze. "Even the prosecution knows it." Calloway stiffened. Judge Holloway frowned. "Mr. Blake." But Thomas wasn't done. "What happens," he continued, "when those in power don't get the verdict they want?" Silence. "They interfere." A cold chill spread through the room. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's eyes swept across them. A man was killed last night. Not because he was guilty of a crime, but because he knew something he wasn't supposed to. He let the weight of that settle. And then, he struck the final blow. "I ask you, if this case is truly about justice, then why is someone willing to kill to silence it?" The room exploded. Gasps. Murmurs. The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain control. "Order. Order in the court." But it was too late. The seed had been planted. The jury had heard the truth. And Thomas knew. Whoever was behind this, they were running out of time. Then, bang! A loud crash erupted from the hallway. The doors burst open. A police officer ran inside, face pale. "Your Honor," he shouted, "we have a problem." Judge Holloway frowned. "What problem?" The officer hesitated. Then he looked straight at Thomas. "Mr. Blake, the mayor is gone." The courtroom went still. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Gone." The officer swallowed hard. "Vanished. Left his house in the middle of the night. His security detail is missing. No one knows where he is." A heavy silence settled. Thomas exhaled slowly. A man on the run, or a man being silenced. Judge Holloway rubbed his temples. "I can't believe this." Then he turned to Thomas. His voice was low, tired. "Mr. Blake, what the hell is happening?" Thomas adjusted his cuffs. "Exactly what I expected," he murmured. Then he turned toward the jury and smiled, because he knew the truth was about to come out, and someone was about to fall. The room stood still. Judge Holloway's face was pale, his fingers tightening around his gavel. "The mayor is gone," he repeated. The officer nodded. "Left in the middle of the night. No security detail. No family. Nothing. Thomas Blake leaned back in his chair, watching the tension unravel around him. Calloway rubbed his forehead. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. Judge Holloway exhaled sharply. Then, he did something unexpected. He turned to Thomas. "Mr. Blake," he said, voice quieter now. "What do you think is happening?" Thomas met his gaze. Then slowly he stood, and everyone leaned in. "This trial was never about justice," Thomas said simply. "It was about control." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Thomas walked toward the jury, hands clasped behind his back. "The mayor was the first to crack," he continued. "When he stormed in here, trying to shut this case down, it wasn't because he cared about the trial." He paused. "It was because he was afraid." Silence. Judge Holloway's grip on the bench tightened. "Afraid of what?" Thomas turned, facing him directly. "Afraid of who's really pulling the strings." The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" But Thomas had already seen it. The jury, the crowd, even Calloway. They were starting to believe him. Judge Holloway took a breath. "Do you have proof?" Thomas smiled. "I'm working on it." Holloway sighed. "Until then, we proceed with the trial." The disappearance of the mayor changes nothing. But Thomas knew better. It changed everything. That night, the courthouse was nearly empty when Thomas finally left. His cane tapped softly against the pavement as he stepped into the cold night air. He wasn't alone. A shadow leaned against a lamppost across the street. Thomas exhaled. "Are you going to follow me all night, Calloway?" The prosecutor stepped forward, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "You were right," Calloway admitted. "This is bigger than a trial." Thomas smirked. "I'm aware." Calloway hesitated. "What's your next move?" Thomas studied him. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I need to speak to someone." Calloway frowned. "Who?" Thomas turned toward the street. "The man they killed last night," he murmured. "He wasn't acting alone." Calloway stiffened. "You think he had a contact?" Thomas nodded. "Someone who knows why he was silenced." Calloway hesitated. "And where do you find someone like that?" Thomas sighed. "Somewhere I hoped I'd never go back to. Midnight, the underground bar." The neon sign flickered above the bar's entrance, its letters half burned out. The inside was dark, smoky, filled with the type of people who didn't ask questions. Thomas stepped inside, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He hadn't been here in years. A low voice greeted him. "Well, well, if it isn't Thomas Blake." A man sat in the corner booth, an old leather jacket draped over his shoulders. His hair was graying at the edges, but his eyes were sharp. "Hello, Daniel," Thomas said as he took a seat. Daniel smirked. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here again." Thomas leaned forward. "I need information." Daniel exhaled. "It's about the trial, isn't it?" Thomas nodded. "The man who was killed last night. He knew something." Daniel was silent. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Thomas picked it up, unfolded it, and his pulse slowed. A list. Names. Powerful names. At the top of the list, Mayor Hendricks. Thomas's fingers curled around the paper. This is what they're hiding." Daniel took a slow sip of his drink. "No," he looked up, eyes dark. "This is just the beginning." Then, bang! A gunshot shattered the window. People screamed. Glass rained down on the bar. Thomas ducked just as another bullet whizzed past his head. Daniel cursed. "They found us." Thomas grabbed the paper and ran. Behind him, the bar erupted into chaos. Someone was trying to shut him up. Again. But they had made a mistake. Because Thomas Blake was just getting started. The bar erupted into chaos. People screamed, knocking over tables and chairs as they scrambled for cover. Thomas Blake moved fast. Faster than a man his age should be able to. A second bullet shattered a liquor bottle behind him. Glass and whiskey sprayed through the air. He ducked low, gripping the list in his hand like it was gold. Because to the people who wanted it buried, it was worth more than gold. Daniel grabbed his arm. "We gotta move now." Thomas didn't argue. The two men rushed toward the back exit. Thomas's cane slammed against the ground, his old instincts kicking in. But just as they reached the door, bang! A third bullet struck the wooden frame inches from Thomas's head. Daniel kicked the door open. "Go! Go! Go!" They burst into the cold night air, their breath visible in the streetlights. Behind them, the shooter was still inside. But not for long. Thomas and Daniel sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the damp brick walls. Thomas's mind raced. Whoever was trying to kill them wasn't sloppy. No wild shots. Every bullet had a target, which meant the shooter wasn't trying to scare them. They were trying to finish the job. Daniel panted as they reached the end of the alley. "Your car nearby?" Thomas shook his head. "Didn't drive." Daniel cursed. "Then we run." Thomas glanced back, just in time to see a shadow move through the alley. They were being followed. He exhaled. "No." Daniel frowned. "No." Thomas looked across the street. "We don't run." Then, before Daniel could react, Thomas stepped into the road, directly into the oncoming traffic. Headlights flashed. Horns blared. Daniel yelled, "Are you insane?" But Thomas had timed it perfectly. He weaved through the cars, forcing the shooter to hesitate. By the time he reached the other side, Daniel was right behind him. They disappeared into the shadows. And the shooter? Lost them. 15 minutes later, safe house. Daniel slammed the door behind them, locking 3 deadbolts. His chest heaved. "You ever gonna tell me what the hell is going on?" Thomas tossed the list onto the table. Daniel picked it up, scanned it, and froze. "Oh hell." Thomas sat down. "Now you understand." Daniel rubbed his jaw. This is bigger than I thought." Thomas nodded. "It always was. The names on the list weren't just powerful. They were untouchable. Judges, politicians, business tycoons, and at the top, Mayor Hendricks." Daniel exhaled. No wonder he ran. Thomas leaned back. He didn't just run. His fingers tapped the table. He was taken. Daniel frowned. "What?" Thomas gestured to the list. The mayor wasn't calling the shots. He was taking orders. Daniel's eyes widened. "You think they silenced him?" Thomas nodded. Daniel muttered a curse. "And now they're coming for you." A heavy silence settled. Then, a phone rang. Not Thomas's. Not Daniel's. The burner phone on the table. Thomas's eyes narrowed. He picked it up, paused, then answered. "Blake." A voice came through. Deep. Steady. "You should have left this alone." Thomas didn't blink. "And yet here we are." A long pause. Then, the voice said, "Walk away." Thomas leaned forward. "Or what?" Another silence. Then the threat. "If you continue this case, Mr. Blake, you won't make it to the verdict." The line went dead. Daniel swallowed. That was them, wasn't it? Thomas placed the phone down. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Yes." Daniel stared. "Why the hell are you smiling?" "They just threatened your life." Thomas picked up the list. "Because," he said, "now I know I'm getting close." The next morning, courthouse. The courtroom was buzzing. The jury whispered among themselves. The crowd was twice the size of yesterday. People wanted to see what would happen next. Judge Holloway took his seat, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Blake," he said, his voice weary, "I assume you have something to present today?" Thomas stood. He walked toward the center of the room. Then, slowly, he pulled out the list. The prosecution table stiffened. Calloway frowned. "What's that?" Thomas met his eyes. "The reason they want this case buried." The courtroom exploded. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. "Mr. Blake, I will not allow theatrics in my court." Thomas nodded. "No theatrics, Your Honor." He held up the list. "These are names of people connected to this case." He turned toward the jury. "The same people who are trying to kill me to keep it quiet." Gasps. Murmurs. Even Calloway looked stunned. Judge Holloway stared. "And where did you get this?" Thomas set it down on the evidence table. "From a man who was murdered trying to expose the truth." The courtroom erupted again. Calloway stood. "Your Honor, this is completely..." Then suddenly, the doors burst open. A team of federal agents rushed in. The lead agent strode forward, flashing his badge. Everyone remained seated. His voice was firm. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "What is the meaning of this?" The agent turned. Then, to everyone's shock, he looked at Calloway and said, "James Calloway, you are under arrest." The entire courtroom froze. Calloway paled. "What?" The agent stepped forward. "We have reason to believe you've been tampering with evidence and working with outside forces to manipulate this case." Gasps. The jury whispered in horror. Calloway shook his head wildly. "This is a mistake. I didn't." But the agents were already on him. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "What is happening here?" The lead agent turned toward Thomas. And for the first time, his face softened. "Mr. Blake," he said, "I believe you just blew open something much bigger than a trial." Thomas exhaled. Then, as Calloway was dragged away, he turned toward the jury. and smiled, because now, the real fight was about to begin. The courtroom was in chaos. People stood up, gasping, whispering, clutching their mouths in disbelief. James Calloway, one of the most feared prosecutors in the district, was being dragged out in handcuffs. His face was twisted in shock, his mouth moving, but no words were coming out. Wait, this is a mistake. I didn't. But the federal agents ignored his protests, forcing him forward. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel, his voice booming. Order. Order in the court. The noise settled, but the tension remained. Everyone turned back to one man. Thomas Blake, standing calm, unshaken. His wrinkled hands rested on his cane, but his sharp eyes never left Calloway. The prosecutor's face was red with rage. You set me up, he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas tilted his head. No, Calloway. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but heavy. You set yourself up. Calloway's eyes flickered with something, panic. The agents pushed him forward, out the doors. Gone. Silence filled the room. Judge Holloway let out a slow breath. Mr. Blake. His voice was careful now, almost respectful. Thomas turned toward him. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench. I assume you have an explanation for what just happened. Thomas nodded. I do. And then, he held up the list. This trial, he said, was never about proving my client guilty. He turned, facing the jury. It was about protecting people in power. A low murmur rippled through the jurors. Thomas continued. Calloway was their pawn. He thought he was just securing an easy win. He paused. But someone was pulling his strings. Judge Holloway exhaled. And you're telling me this, he gestured to the list, is connected? Thomas nodded. Yes. He walked toward the evidence table, placing the document down carefully. Calloway tampered with evidence. He covered up inconsistencies. He worked for someone. The judge leaned forward. And who exactly was he working for? Thomas inhaled. Then slowly, deliberately, he said, the mayor. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Judge Holloway's eyes widened. But the mayor is missing. Thomas smiled faintly. Exactly. The room stilled. Judge Holloway looked down at the list, scanning the names. His fingers traced the paper, stopping at the very top. A muscle in his jaw twitched. My God. Thomas clasped his hands behind his back. Now you understand. The judge lifted his gaze. Mr. Blake. His voice was quiet. What exactly have you uncovered? Thomas exhaled. Then, the doors swung open again. A different officer rushed in. His face was pale. His eyes darted straight to Thomas. And then, he spoke 3 words. Words that sent a chill down the entire courtroom. We found him. Silence. Judge Holloway frowned. Who? The officer swallowed. The mayor. The room froze. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Where? The officer hesitated. Then, quietly, carefully, he said. In the river. Dead. 1 hour later, the crime scene. The river stretched wide beneath the steel bridge. Police lights flashed in the dark, painting the water in red and blue. Thomas stood at the edge of the scene, his coat billowing in the wind. His stomach tightened as he looked down at the lifeless body on the riverbank. Mayor Hendricks. Face pale. Suit soaked. Dead. Daniel, standing beside him, muttered under his breath. Well, that's inconvenient. Thomas didn't answer. He was staring at the mayor's hands. Something was off. He stepped closer, ignoring the officer's muttering behind him. Then, he saw it. His fingers curled. His suit too perfect. His body positioned too neatly. Thomas exhaled slowly. They staged it, he murmured. Daniel frowned. What? Thomas straightened. This wasn't a drowning. He turned toward the nearest officer. Get the coroner. The officer hesitated. Sir, we all ready. Get the coroner. Something was wrong. And then, he saw it. Just beneath the mayor's collar, a bruise. Small. Faint. But unmistakable. Daniel followed his gaze. His face paled. Oh hell. Thomas nodded. They strangled him. A heavy silence. Daniel ran a hand over his face. Why fake a drowning? Thomas's mind raced. Then, it clicked. They needed him to disappear, Thomas said. But they didn't want an investigation. Daniel exhaled sharply. So they made it look like an accident. Thomas nodded. Then very quietly he said, but someone made a mistake. Daniel frowned. What? Thomas turned toward the officer. His house, Thomas said. Has it been searched? The officer shook his head. Not yet. Thomas grabbed his coat. Then we're going there. 30 minutes later, Mayor's house. The house was dark, deserted. The door was unlocked. Daniel shifted uncomfortably as they stepped inside. This feels like a bad idea. Thomas ignored him. His sharp eyes scanned the room. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. But then, a creak. Thomas's head snapped up. From upstairs. Daniel froze. Did you hear that? Thomas didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small revolver. Daniel's eyes widened. Jesus, you carry? Thomas gave him a look. I'm old. Not stupid. Then, he moved toward the stairs. Step. By step. By step. The air was heavy. The house too quiet. And then, he reached the study. The door was slightly open. Thomas exhaled. Then, with a steady hand, he pushed it open. And froze. A man sat at the mayor's desk. Calm. Unshaken. Waiting. Dressed in a black coat, a silver tie. A fixer. Thomas's grip on his revolver tightened. The man smiled. Mr. Blake, he said, voice smooth. You've been busy. Thomas exhaled. And raised his gun. The air in the study thickened. Thomas Blake stood in the doorway, his revolver steady, pointed directly at the man in the black coat. The fixer, calm as ever, smirked. No need for that, he said smoothly, his hands resting on the desk. I'm just here to talk. Thomas didn't lower the gun. You people don't talk, he said. You silence. The fixer chuckled. Fair enough. Daniel stood behind Thomas, barely breathing. Ah, Blake, maybe let's not shoot someone in the mayor's house. Thomas ignored him. He studied the fixer, taking in the small details. The controlled breathing. The slight shift in posture. This man was a professional. And professionals only showed up for one reason. You killed the mayor, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. The fixer sighed. Technically no. But let's not get lost in the details. Thomas's jaw tightened. Why stage it? The fixer tilted his head. To make things easier. For everyone. Thomas snorted. For everyone or for you? The fixer shrugged. Is there a difference? A long silence. Then, the fixer leaned forward, folding his hands. Here's the deal, Mr. Blake, he said, his voice smooth as glass. You've done well. More than we expected. He smiled. But now, it's time to walk away. Thomas arched an eyebrow. You people really love repeating yourselves. The fixer sighed. And you really love ignoring warnings. His eyes darkened. I'm going to give you one last chance, he said quietly. Drop the case. Leave town. And you get to live the rest of your days in peace. His fingers tapped the desk. Or, he continued, you keep pushing, and you don't live long enough to see the verdict. A cold chill settled over the room. Daniel shifted. Okay, so, I vote we leave. Thomas didn't blink, didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. Then, he did something the fixer didn't expect. He lowered his gun. The fixer raised an eyebrow. Good. A smart decision. Thomas stepped forward. And then, without warning, bam! Thomas slammed the butt of his revolver against the fixer's face. The man stumbled back, cursing. Daniel's eyes bulged. What the? The fixer clutched his jaw, blood trickling from his lip. Then he laughed. A soft, amused chuckle. You've got some fight left in you, he muttered, wiping his mouth. Thomas cocked his revolver. More than you think. The fixer tilted his head. Shame. Then, he moved. Fast. Before Thomas could react, the fixer grabbed the edge of the desk and flipped it. Papers flew everywhere. Daniel shouted. Thomas fired a shot. Bang! The bullet missed, just as the fixer lunged. They crashed into the bookshelf, knocking it over. The fight exploded. Daniel stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. Oh, we're doing this. Okay, cool. I'll just watch. The fixer was fast. He swung, but Thomas dodged. He grabbed Thomas's wrist, twisting. Crack. The revolver fell to the floor. The fixer yanked Thomas forward, slamming him into the desk. Thomas's vision blurred. Pain shot through his ribs. The fixer leaned in. You're too old for this. Thomas smirked. Then he headbutted him. Crack. The fixer stumbled back, stunned. Thomas grabbed his cane and swung. Thwack. The cane slammed into the fixer's leg. The man dropped to one knee, hissing in pain. Thomas loomed over him, breathing hard. I may be old, he said, gripping his cane, but I've had more fights than you've had birthdays. The fixer grinned. Then he pulled a knife. Thomas froze. The blade gleamed under the dim light. Daniel panicked. Okay, nope. Not liking this. The fixer rose to his feet, flipping the knife between his fingers. "This was fun," he said, voice still smooth. Then he lunged. Bang! A gunshot. The fixer stopped. His knife clattered to the floor. Then slowly he looked down. A bullet hole in his shoulder. His breathing turned ragged. Behind him, in the doorway, a woman stood, holding a gun, her eyes sharp, focused. Thomas blinked. "Susan." The courtroom receptionist lowered her gun. "We need to go," she said. Daniel pointed at her. "Okay, what the hell?" Susan ignored him. The fixer wavered, gripping his wound. Then he smirked. "This isn't over," he whispered. Then he collapsed. Susan exhaled. "Move. Now." Thomas shook off his shock. "You first." They rushed out of the study, leaving the fixer bleeding on the floor. As they ran into the night, Thomas's mind raced. Why was Susan here? Why did she have a gun? And more importantly, what else was she hiding? The night air was cold as Thomas, Daniel, and Susan hurried down the street, their footsteps quick and deliberate. The fixer was down, but not dead, and Thomas knew he would come back. As they rounded a corner, Daniel finally exploded. Okay, hold up." He skidded to a stop, throwing up his hands. "Can someone please explain what the hell just happened?" Thomas exhaled, adjusting his coat. "Which part?" Daniel pointed wildly at Susan. "Her." Susan stood calmly, her gun still in her hand. The same Susan who worked as a courtroom receptionist. The same Susan who, up until now, had been nothing but a polite, smiling assistant in the courthouse. Daniel's eyes bulged. "Why do you have a gun? Why did you just shoot a guy? Are you even a receptionist? Am I even real? What is happening?" Susan tucked the gun into her jacket. "It's complicated." Daniel let out a hysterical laugh. "Oh good, that clears it right up." Thomas turned to Susan, his sharp gaze locked onto her. "I assume," he said calmly, "this isn't your first time handling a weapon." Susan met his gaze. Didn't blink. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." Daniel waved his arms. "She says it like it's normal." Thomas tilted his head. "And I assume you didn't just happen to be at the mayor's house tonight." Susan sighed. "No." Silence. Then, Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Who do you really work for?" Susan crossed her arms. "You, apparently." Daniel made a choked sound. "I need a drink." Thomas stepped forward. "Explain." Susan hesitated. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a badge. "FBI." Thomas's eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel stumbled back. What? Susan sighed. "I was placed in the courthouse as a plant. I was investigating corruption in the city's justice system." She looked at Thomas. "Then your trial started. And suddenly, all my leads started lining up." Thomas crossed his arms. "So you followed me?" Susan nodded. "I knew you'd dig up something big. But even I didn't expect it to lead to this." Daniel dragged a hand down his face. "So let me get this straight. You're an FBI agent posing as a receptionist in a corrupt courthouse investigating a conspiracy involving the mayor's murder, and you just so happened to save our lives." Susan shrugged. "Basically." Daniel nodded. Cool. Yeah, totally normal. Nothing crazy. Not at all having a crisis right now." Thomas ignored him. He looked at Susan and smirked. "Well," he said, "now we're getting somewhere." 30 minutes later, safe house. They sat around a dimly lit table. Susan spread files across the surface. "Everything we know points to a single truth," she said. "The mayor wasn't calling the shots. He was following orders." Thomas nodded. "I figured as much." Susan tapped the list Thomas had taken. "These names? Some of them overlap with my investigation. Judges, officers, politicians." Daniel exhaled. "How deep does this go?" Susan looked at Thomas. Then quietly she said, "All the way to the top." Silence. Then Thomas leaned forward. "Who is at the top?" Susan hesitated. Then she pulled out a photo. "Set it down." Thomas stared. Then his blood ran cold. Daniel frowned. Who's that?" Susan's voice was grim. "That," she said, "is Senator William Caldwell." Daniel blinked. "The presidential candidate?" Susan nodded. "And the man who has been controlling everything from the start." A heavy silence. Then, Thomas exhaled and smiled. Daniel gawked. "Why are you smiling?" Thomas tapped the photo. "Because," he said, "I finally know who I'm taking down." The next morning, courthouse. The trial continued. But everything was different now. Thomas stood before the jury, his presence commanding. He knew the truth. And now, it was time to expose it. He adjusted his tie. Then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this trial is no longer about a single man's guilt or innocence." He took a step forward. "This trial is about a cover-up, a crime so deep, so tangled in our own justice system, that those in power will do anything to keep it buried." The jury shifted. The judge watched carefully. And in the back of the courtroom, a man in a black suit watched. Thomas's eyes flickered toward him. The fixer. Alive. Bandaged. But very much watching. Thomas smirked. Then louder, bolder, unshaken. He said the words that would change everything. "The real mastermind behind this cover-up is Senator William Caldwell." Gasps. The entire courtroom erupted. The judge gaped. The jury froze. And the fixer? He stood up. Left the courtroom. Because now, the war had begun. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. A tidal wave of disbelief crashed through the crowd. A sitting senator. A presidential candidate. And Thomas Blake had just named him as the mastermind. Judge Holloway's face drained of color. His fingers curled around his gavel, his knuckles turning white. "Order! Order in the court." He slammed the gavel again and again, but the noise didn't stop. The jury whispered, exchanging glances. The spectators leaned forward, hungry for more. And in the back of the courtroom, the fixer was gone. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had expected pushback. What he didn't expect was the doors suddenly bursting open. A team of men in black suits stormed in. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold eyes, flashed a badge. "FBI." His voice was like steel. "This trial is over." Chaos unleashed. Judge Holloway stood. "You can't just." The FBI agent cut him off. "This case is now under federal jurisdiction." Murmurs exploded through the crowd. Susan stood quickly from the spectator bench. Her eyes narrowed. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he smiled. He turned to the agent. "That was fast," he mused. "Did you get your orders from Senator Caldwell himself?" The agent's jaw tightened. Susan stepped forward. "I'm Agent Susan Carter, FBI." She pulled out her own badge. "On whose orders is this trial being shut down?" The lead agent glanced at her badge. Then he smirked. "You're out of your league, Carter." Susan's hand twitched toward her gun. "Try me." The lead agent stepped forward. "Enough games. Thomas Blake, you're coming with us." Daniel, who had been silent this entire time, gasped. "Whoa, WHOA. Since when is Blake under arrest?" The agent didn't answer. Two other agents moved toward Thomas. Thomas sighed, shaking his head. "You people never learn." The moment they reached for him, Susan moved first. She spun, grabbing the first agent's wrist and twisting it. Crack! The agent cried out. His gun clattered to the floor. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Daniel dove under a table. "Oh, this is a nightmare." Judge Holloway stood, yelling. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas sidestepped another agent, his old instincts kicking in. Susan blocked another punch, slammed her knee into an agent's stomach, and sent him crashing into the jury stand. The jury screamed. The lead agent gritted his teeth. "Carter, stand down." Susan glared. "You first." Then, a gun was cocked. Silence. One of the remaining agents had his gun pointed directly at Thomas. The entire courtroom froze. Thomas held his breath. The agent's finger tightened on the trigger. And then, boom. A loud explosion rocked the courthouse. Smoke poured in from the hall. Screams erupted. The agent hesitated. And that was all the time Thomas needed. He grabbed his cane. Swung. The agent's gun went flying. Susan grabbed Thomas's arm. "We need to move." Daniel poked his head out. "Are we dead yet?" Thomas ignored him. He grabbed the case files from the evidence table and bolted. Susan covered their retreat. The smoke thickened. And as they ran, Thomas knew. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a war. The escape. They burst into the side exit of the courthouse. Gunfire erupted behind them. Daniel yelped. "Why is there gunfire? Why is there always gunfire?" Susan shoved him forward. "Keep moving." They reached the parking lot. Susan pulled out a set of keys and pointed to an unmarked black car. "Get in." Thomas and Daniel scrambled inside. Susan hit the gas. The tires screeched. Behind them, more agents spilled out of the courthouse. Shots rang out. A bullet shattered the back windshield. Daniel screamed. "We're gonna die." Thomas stayed calm. He turned to Susan. Where are we going? Susan's jaw was tight. Somewhere safe. Thomas exhaled. There's no such place anymore. The truth uncovered. 30 minutes later, they pulled into an abandoned warehouse. Susan killed the engine. Silence. Daniel's hands were shaking. I want to go home. Thomas opened his briefcase. Pulled out the case files. They spread them out on the hood of the car. Susan leaned in. What are we looking at? Thomas's eyes flickered with understanding. Then, he pointed to a name. Here. Susan frowned. The name was familiar. Daniel squinted. Who's that? Thomas exhaled. This, he said, is the one person who can take Caldwell down. Susan's eyes widened. Daniel's mouth fell open. Because the name on the file wasn't just anyone. It was someone no one had expected. A name that could change everything. Judge Richard Holloway. Silence hung heavy in the abandoned warehouse. Susan Carter, FBI agent, leaned over the car hood, staring at the name on the file. Judge Richard Holloway. Daniel, still pale from their courthouse escape, pointed at the paper. Okay, I don't get it. Why is the judge's name here? Thomas Blake folded his arms. Because Judge Holloway isn't just presiding over this case. He's part of it. Susan's breath hitched. You're saying he's involved? Thomas shook his head. No, I'm saying he's the key. Daniel groaned. Man, I hate riddles. Just explain it before I have an actual heart attack. Thomas tapped the file. Look at the dates. The mayor, Calloway, the fixer, they were all working under the same orders. But someone blocked certain motions from passing. Someone slowed down the legal maneuvers they were trying to push through. Susan's eyes widened. Holloway. Thomas nodded. For months, he's been resisting pressure. And that makes him dangerous. Daniel's jaw clenched. And now that you just dropped Caldwell's name in open court, Holloway's a walking target. Susan muttered a curse. They'll try to silence him. Thomas grabbed his coat. Not if we get to him first. 30 minutes later, Judge Holloway's home. The house was dark. Too dark. Thomas, Susan, and Daniel stood outside, the tension thick. Susan glanced at the quiet windows. Something's wrong. Thomas didn't answer. He gripped his cane tighter. Daniel exhaled. This feels like a horror movie. Susan ignored him, pulling out her gun. I'll go first. Thomas stopped her. I'll go, he said. Susan frowned. You're not armed. Thomas smiled. I don't need to be. Then, before she could argue, he stepped inside. The door was unlocked. Not broken. Not forced. Just open. His instincts screamed at him. But Thomas moved forward. The air inside was still. Too still. His shoes barely made a sound against the wooden floor. And then he saw it. The study door was open. Inside, Judge Richard Holloway sat at his desk. Motionless. His hands folded. His face calm. Too calm. Thomas froze. Something was wrong. Then, the judge slowly looked up. His eyes met Thomas's. And Thomas knew. Judge Holloway wasn't alone. Someone else was in the room. Thomas didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, a voice spoke from the shadows. Smooth. Cold. Familiar. I knew you'd come, Blake. From behind the desk, the fixer stepped forward. Still alive. Still standing. Smiling. Thomas exhaled slowly. I was wondering when we'd meet again. The fixer chuckled. I must admit, I underestimated you. He gestured toward the judge. You're just in time for the final offer. Judge Holloway's hands tightened into fists. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What offer? The fixer stepped closer. You walk away, he said simply. Right now. No trial. No fight. Just disappear. His eyes darkened. And in return, Holloway lives. Silence. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened, his breathing shaky. Thomas looked at him. Is that what you want, Richard? The judge exhaled. He hesitated. They said they'd go after my family if I didn't cooperate. Thomas's stomach twisted. The fixer sighed. It's a generous deal. Thomas nodded slowly. Then, in a calm voice, he asked, and if I say no? The fixer smiled. Then, he pulled out a gun, aimed it directly at Holloway's head. Judge Holloway closed his eyes. Thomas didn't move, didn't flinch. The fixer tilted his head. So, what's your answer? Thomas exhaled. Then, quietly, confidently, he said, You should have brought more men. The fixer frowned. Then, the window shattered. Bang! A gunshot rang out. The fixer jerked back, cursing. From outside, Susan's voice shouted, Go! 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 The fight erupted. Judge Holloway ducked. Thomas grabbed the nearest object, a paperweight, and hurled it. It smashed against the fixer's arm. His gun clattered to the floor. The door burst open. Susan rushed in, gun raised. Daniel stumbled in behind her. Why do we keep running into gunfights? The fixer recovered fast. He lunged for the gun. Thomas kicked it away. The fixer's face darkened. Then, he did something unexpected. He smirked. You think you've won, he said. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Haven't we? The fixer's smirk widened. And then, a phone rang. Thomas froze. The fixer pulled a burner phone from his pocket. Answered it. A voice came through. Cold. Powerful. Familiar. Enough. The fixer nodded once. Then he stepped back. Thomas's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. And then, the fixer held out the phone. Senator Caldwell wants to speak to you. The room stood still. Thomas Blake stared at the phone in the fixer's hand. A single name echoed in his mind. Senator William Caldwell. The man pulling every string. The man responsible for everything. Judge Holloway sat frozen at his desk, his face pale. Susan stood tense, her gun still raised. Daniel, for once, had no jokes. The fixer, bleeding, smirking, extended the phone again. Go on, he said. Answer it. Thomas exhaled. Then he did. He took the phone, held it to his ear, and said 2 words. I'm listening. The voice of power. Senator Caldwell's voice came through the line. Steady. Unshaken. Mr. Blake, he said, as if they were old friends. You've been quite the problem. Thomas smirked. So I've heard. Caldwell sighed. You could have had a peaceful retirement. You could have walked away. Thomas leaned on his cane. I could have. He glanced at Holloway. But then you started killing people. Silence. Then Caldwell chuckled. People like you, he said, think the law is about justice. It's not. His voice was smooth. It's about who controls it. Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. Caldwell continued calmly. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop this case. You're going to disappear. And in return, his voice lowered. I won't kill you. Susan stiffened. Daniel gasped. That's not a great deal. Thomas's heart slowed. Caldwell sighed. I admire your persistence. But persistence doesn't keep people alive. Thomas exhaled. Then he smiled. You know, he said, you remind me of a man I once took down 30 years ago. Caldwell didn't respond. Thomas continued. He thought he was untouchable too. A pause. Then Caldwell spoke. You think you can beat me? His voice was almost amused. Thomas tilted his head. Oh, I don't think, Senator. He let the words sink in. I know. Silence. Then Caldwell's voice dropped. This was your last mistake. The line went dead. The fixer grinned. Well, that was dramatic. Susan fired. Bang. The bullet missed the fixer's head by inches. He flinched. Susan's voice was deadly. Move again, and I won't miss. The fixer raised his hands. Relax, Carter. Thomas set the phone down. We're leaving. The fixer chuckled. Leaving won't change anything. Thomas smirked. We'll see about that. Then, without another word, they walked out. The plan. 30 minutes later, they sat in a safe house. Susan paced. We just declared war on a sitting senator. Daniel groaned. I feel like I should be drinking for this. Judge Holloway sat stiffly. Caldwell isn't bluffing. He'll kill us. Thomas took a breath. Then we hit first. Susan stopped pacing. How? Thomas placed a USB drive on the table. Everyone stared. Daniel squinted. What's that? Thomas smiled. The end of Caldwell. Susan grabbed it. Plugged it into a laptop. Screens flashed. Then, her breath hitched. Oh my God. Daniel leaned in. What? Is it memes? I swear, if it's memes. Susan turned the screen. And Daniel stopped breathing. Because on the screen, emails, wire transfers, and most damning of all, a direct conversation between Caldwell and the mayor. Susan muttered, This is enough to bury him. Thomas leaned forward. And we're going to make sure it does. The last stand. The next morning, Thomas Blake walked into the courthouse. The world was watching. News cameras everywhere. Because after today, Senator William Caldwell was done. As he stepped into the courtroom, he felt it. The weight of history. Judge Holloway took his seat. The jury, the spectators, everyone waited. And then, the doors opened. 2 federal agents walked in. One of them stepped forward. Then, loud enough for the world to hear. We have an arrest warrant for Senator William Caldwell. The courtroom exploded. And Thomas Blake? He smiled, because justice had finally won. The moment the words left the agent's mouth, the courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, shock. A sitting senator, one of the most powerful men in the country, was being brought down. Judge Holloway's hands tightened on the bench. The jury exchanged nervous glances. The spectators leaned forward, hungry for every second of history unfolding before them. And Thomas Blake? He simply sat, waiting, watching, knowing, because he wasn't done yet. The fall of Caldwell. The federal agents stepped aside, and from the back of the courtroom, Senator William Caldwell himself walked in. His expensive suit was crisp, his silver hair neatly combed, his face calm. Too calm. Daniel exhaled sharply. Why does he look like he's about to order a martini? Susan didn't move. Her hand hovered near her holster. Because he doesn't think he's lost yet. Caldwell strode forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Then he stopped, turned to Thomas, and smirked. A final gambit. Mr. Blake, Caldwell said, his voice smooth as silk. I have to say, I'm impressed. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Caldwell nodded. Most people who challenge me don't live long enough to see the consequences. Susan tensed. That a threat? Caldwell chuckled. An observation. Judge Holloway finally spoke. His voice was measured. Senator, do you understand the charges against you? Caldwell sighed. Oh, I understand. I just don't care. The courtroom froze. The federal agents stiffened. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, before you embarrass yourselves, I suggest you check with the Department of Justice. The lead agent frowned. Excuse me. Caldwell smirked. Go ahead. Make the call. The agent hesitated, then pulled out his radio. HQ, confirm arrest order on Senator Caldwell. A pause. Then, static crackled. A voice responded. Stand down. Gasps. Daniel froze. What? Susan's eyes widened. No. No way. The agent's face turned pale. Repeat that. The voice came again. Do not engage. Orders from above. Stand down. A cold chill settled over the courtroom. The lead agent swallowed hard. He turned back to Caldwell, and then slowly, painfully, lowered his handcuffs. A slow smile spread across Caldwell's face. He turned to Thomas and whispered, I told you, you don't win against me. A rigged game. Thomas stared, not in shock, not in fear, but in understanding, because now he saw it. The pieces, the power, the system itself. It wasn't broken. It was built this way. Judge Holloway's hands curled into fists. This is outrageous. Caldwell shrugged. This is reality. Susan gritted her teeth. You pulled the right strings, didn't you? Caldwell smiled. I don't pull strings. I own them. The federal agents backed away. And just like that, Senator William Caldwell walked free. The lowest point. The courtroom emptied fast. News reporters swarmed Caldwell. Cameras flashed. His smug face filled every screen. And in the middle of it all, Thomas Blake sat still. Susan rubbed her forehead. They just let him walk. Daniel sank into a chair. I think I'm going to be sick. Judge Holloway sighed. This is how it always works. Thomas exhaled. Then he stood. Daniel blinked. Where are you going? Thomas adjusted his suit. To finish this. Susan frowned. Blake, we just lost. The DOJ shut us down. Thomas smiled faintly. No, he said. They just made their biggest mistake. Susan's eyes narrowed. How? Thomas picked up his briefcase. Because, he said, Caldwell thinks the law protects him. He turned toward the courtroom doors. But I don't need the law. A pause. Then, quietly, firmly. I just need the truth. The final move. That night, Thomas Blake went to war. No lawyers. No courtrooms. Just the truth. By morning, a storm would hit. And Caldwell wouldn't see it coming. The night was silent. Too silent. Thomas Blake sat in the back of an unmarked car, staring out at the senator's estate. The lights inside Caldwell's mansion glowed, illuminating the luxury within. A fortress. But no fortress was impenetrable. Susan, sitting in the driver's seat, exhaled. I can't believe we're doing this. Daniel, in the back with Thomas, clutched his seatbelt like a lifeline. I want to be on record saying this is a terrible idea. Thomas smirked. Duly noted. Susan shook her head. This is crazy, Blake. Caldwell just embarrassed the entire justice system, and you think you can take him down outside the law? Thomas's voice was steady. I don't think, he said. I know. The plan. Susan pulled the car to the side of the road. The estate was heavily guarded, security cameras watching every entrance. We can't just walk in, Susan muttered. They'll shoot first, ask questions later. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulled out a flash drive. This is how we walk in. Daniel blinked. It's a USB stick. Thomas smiled. Not just any USB stick. Susan frowned. What's on it? Thomas leaned forward. The one thing Caldwell never planned for. He met Susan's gaze. A confession. Breaking the system. 1 hour later, the world changed. Susan sat in front of a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Daniel paced. I don't get it. A confession from who? Susan exhaled. From the one person they didn't silence in time. She pressed enter. And then across the internet. The truth spread like wildfire. The leak. At exactly 6 a.m., every major news outlet received a video. A recording. Of Mayor Hendricks. Days before he was murdered. His voice shaky, desperate. They're coming for me, the mayor said. I tried to stop it. I tried. But they own the courts. The judges. Even the DOJ. He swallowed hard. Then, he said the name. The man behind it all is Senator William Caldwell. Chaos. The nation reacts. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Breaking news. Leaked recording implicates Senator Caldwell in nationwide conspiracy. Twitter, Facebook, every social media outlet flooded with the same message. Caldwell was exposed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The last stand. The senator's estate erupted in panic. Security scrambled. Phones rang. Inside, Caldwell's face twisted in rage. He slammed his fist against the desk. This is impossible. Then his phone rang. He answered. A voice calm as ever. Good morning, Senator. Caldwell's hands shook. Blake. Thomas's voice was calm. You lost. Caldwell's face turned red. I still have power. I can still. No, Thomas cut in. His voice hardened. You had power. A long silence. Then, Caldwell exhaled. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to lose. Justice wins. By noon, the arrest warrant was back. This time, no one stopped it. FBI agents stormed the estate. And this time, there was no escape. The end of a legacy. Caldwell was dragged out in handcuffs. The cameras flashed. The world watched. And in the back of the crowd, Thomas Blake stood. Susan, beside him, let out a slow breath. You did it. Thomas adjusted his tie. No. He watched as Caldwell was stuffed into a black car, his empire crumbling around him. The truth did. 1 week later, the world had changed. Caldwell's network? Destroyed. The DOJ? Under investigation. The justice system? Forced to answer for its corruption. And Thomas Blake? He sat at his favorite diner, drinking tea. Daniel sat across from him. So what now? Thomas smiled faintly. Now. He took a sip. Now I rest. Susan chuckled. For how long? Thomas smirked. Until someone else thinks they're untouchable. Daniel groaned. God help us all. Thomas just smiled. Because justice, true justice, would always find a way.